The first question you got to ask yourself is, are you adaptable and agile? And that's it. If you're going to thrive and succeed as a virtual leader, then you have to be adaptable and you have to be agile. What does that mean? That means that I have an ability to adjust, to modify, or to change my communication, my leadership style, my behavior, my environment, my organizational culture in order to produce a positive result as a leader. In essence, an adaptable and an agile leader is someone that, number one, they identify the challenge. And so what is the challenge? The challenge is I'm moving now from in-person to a virtual experience as a leader. That is the challenge. Number two, they develop solutions. They're innovative. They develop ways that they can adjust, that they can modify, that they can change the way they lead in order to ultimately produce positive results. So ultimately, if I'm going to be effective at leading and thriving in a virtual world, I got to be adaptable. Now, the question becomes, why do I got to be adaptable? Why do I got to be agile? Well, number one, leading virtually is different from leading in person. And again, we're going to get more into this as we go along, but studies show it's very clear, just like when you go to class, the same is true with leadership. There's certain things that must be adjusted when it comes to leadership from a virtual setting that you may not have to adjust if you're in an in-person setting. And number two, the reason why this is important, because I believe with all of my heart, if you're unable to adapt, if you're unable to adjust, if you're unable to modify the way in which you do things as a leader from an in-person to a virtual environment, there's a good chance that you're ultimately going to be ineffective. In essence, if you are not able to make the adjustments, there's a good chance you're going to be ineffective. And one of the greatest examples is Blockbusters. I'm not sure of how many of you remember Blockbusters. This was back in the late 90s, the early 2000s. Remember Blockbusters? And they had videos, they had video games, they had gummy bears, they had chips, they had everything you could have to create a movie environment at your house. And I remember, they had the deals, they had the sales that were going on. I remember going there, and I remember, renting movies and going home and having a date for $10. I call it a Blockbuster date. But ultimately, things begin to shift, and the new generation began to evolve. And there was a generation that didn't want to go to the store. There was a generation that wanted to just get on their computer. They wanted to have access to movies and access to films immediately. And Blockbusters was unwilling to adapt, although the timing, the demographics, and the season required them to adapt in order to thrive and succeed. And so because of their unwillingness to adapt, because of their unwillingness to change, because of their unwillingness to modify, Netflix arises. And now Netflix is a multi-billion-dollar company that is thriving, that is succeeding today because Blockbusters was unwilling to adapt. And I think the same is true with leadership. I do not believe that this virtual leadership is going anywhere. As a matter of fact, I think it's going to even increase more and more. There was actually a quote by the president of Twitter, and he talked about how he believes that this whole transition from in-person to what they call remote working is actually going to become what they call the new normal. Even when things get back to normal, people are still going to be utilizing remote working and virtual leadership. And so it's important that we're not running away from the problem, but we're attacking the problem, we're addressing the problem, and ultimately we're making the modifications necessary in order to thrive and succeed in a virtual environment as a leader. I'm gonna love this quote by Charles Darwin. He says, and I quote, he says, "It's not the strongest or the smartest that survives, but rather it's the one who's most adaptable." The leaders that thrive, the leaders that succeed, the leaders that leave legacy are those that are able to adapt. They're able to adjust. They're what we call, they're flexible. As Huffington Post said, they said the most important skill set in the 21st century for leaders is an ability to be flexible, to adjust, and to adapt. And to go a step farther, there was actually a study, and they found that those who are remote workers and those who work from home as leaders, they said one of the most important skill sets was this ability to adjust, was this ability to adapt, was this ability to modify your leadership style so that you become more effective at leading a remote team, at leading a virtual team versus leading people in person. That's what they said. And it's so true, because this is what I've discovered as a virtual leader. I've discovered as a virtual leader, my communication is going to change. My leadership is going to change. The way I build relationships is going to change. The way we work as a team is going to change. Sometimes even the organizational culture or environment has to change. In essence, there's so many changes. There's so many makeovers. There's so many modifications that must be made in order to make the adjustment from what I call an in-person place of leadership to a virtual leadership. And as leaders, we not only going to be aware of the change, but we got to begin to develop solutions so that we can lead more effectively and we can empower others around us to lead more effectively as well. As I shared with you earlier, I had to make that adjustment as a speaker. Literally, for 15 years, I had traveled the country as a speaker. I was empowering audiences all across the country. Literally spoke in 48 different states and 3 different countries, and I loved it. I mean, I absolutely loved speaking in front of audiences. As I said earlier, when March 12th happened, COVID hit, and everything shifted. Not a decision I had to make. Am I going to stay in the past, or am I going to adjust, adapt, and modify to the future? I shared with you earlier, I made the modifications. I began to learn everything I could about how I could create a digital studio. I began to learn about cameras. I began to learn about different devices. I began to learn about lighting. I began to learn about having green screens. I began to learn about virtual producers. I began to learn about how can we include more excitement, and how can we even make our screen more appealing to those who are watching. All these thoughts begin to go through my mind. And how do I deliver a program? And how do I communicate virtually? Because there's no crowd and there's no interaction actually in person. I can't feel the energy as I can't feel the energy virtually as I can in person. There are all these adjustments and these changes I had to make in order to be here, right now. But thankfully, because I was able to adapt, not only as a leader of my own business, but even as a speaker, I've been able to speak to audiences. I've been able to speak to students. I've been able to speak to professionals. I've been able to offer service and offer value and still make an impact as a leader and a speaker virtually. Why? Because I was willing to adapt. I was willing to adapt the way I did things. I was willing to adapt even how I communicate. I was able to adapt how I present. There were so many different things I had to adjust and I had to modify to deliver this presentation today. And the same is true with you as a leader. If you're going to be an effective leader in a virtual world, ultimately, but you're going to have to ask yourself, okay, I see the challenges, and these are the challenges that are identified. Now, what solutions am I going to create to ensure that I can still lead, that I can still do what I need to do in a virtual way? In that sense, what's the how? I got to assess my challenges. What are some challenges that I'm facing in school, in my life, or as a leader right now because of the shift from in-person to virtual? Number two, once I identify the challenges, I got to develop solutions. I got to be innovative. I got to educate myself. I got to learn, what can I do? What are people doing to be more effective and make the transition from in-person to virtual? And then once I do that, I got to be courageous, because some stuff's going to be new. Some stuff's going to cause you like, is this going to work? There's going to be failure. But I have the courage to move forward and to try new things, because you got to remember, failure is a preparation for success based on how you perceive the situation. In essence, if you have the right lens and the right perspective of failure, failure can actually be a launching pad to greater levels of success, growth, and progression. And so you got to have that in the back of your mind as you're making the adjustment in a time of adaptability and flexibility and modification. And then number three, you want to modify. You want to assess and you want to modify. Modify and assess, because there's going to be consistent improvements. There's going to be things you're going to need to change. Listen, I've been doing this for 6 months, and based on my ability to fail, to modify, and to adjust, I'm in a much better place today virtually than I was back in March. Why? Because I had the courage to act. I began to learn. I begin to ask people, I begin to gather information, and then I've been able to modify. I've been able to make improvements to get better and better. First point that is so incredibly important, if I want to be effective at leading in a virtual environment, is I got to be adaptable and I got to be adjustable. I got to be adaptable and I got to be adjustable. Now,